As Gulf tensions explode, Mohammed bin Salman reportedly refused to join a dangerous anti-Iran war alliance backed by regional powers, exposing deep cracks between Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Israel. With missiles, oil routes, and military threats escalating rapidly, the Middle East may be heading toward its most dangerous regional confrontation in years. The Middle East is entering one of its most dangerous and unpredictable phases in recent years. Rising tensions involving Iran, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the United Arab Emirates are exposing deep divisions inside the Gulf region and reshaping the balance of power across the Middle East. At the center of this rapidly evolving crisis is Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. As regional pressure intensified following the latest escalation involving Iran and Israel, many expected Saudi Arabia to fully align itself with anti-Iran efforts supported by Israel and some Gulf allies. But instead of openly joining a wider confrontation against Tehran, Riyadh appears to have chosen a more cautious and calculated strategy. Saudi Arabia still views Iran as a major regional threat. Saudi officials remain deeply concerned about Tehran's growing missile arsenal, expanding drone capabilities, and increasing influence across the Middle East. However, Riyadh also understands that a direct regional war could trigger devastating consequences for every Gulf country involved. That fear is shaping nearly every major decision Saudi Arabia is making today. Recent reports suggested growing coordination between the United Arab Emirates and Israel during the latest regional crisis involving Iran. While Emirati officials publicly denied reports of secret wartime meetings and covert coordination, speculation surrounding deeper UAE-Israel security ties intensified across the region. Those reports also fueled wider discussions about growing differences between Saudi Arabia and the UAE over how aggressively Gulf states should confront Tehran. Although Riyadh and Abu Dhabi remain close allies publicly, regional observers increasingly believe that both countries are pursuing different strategic visions behind the scenes. The UAE has developed increasingly close ties with Israel since signing the Abraham Accords. Security cooperation, intelligence sharing, economic partnerships, and regional coordination have expanded significantly between the two sides over recent years. As tensions with Iran escalated, the UAE reportedly appeared more open to supporting tougher regional pressure against Tehran. Saudi Arabia, however, seems to be taking a different approach. Riyadh appears determined to avoid becoming trapped inside a direct and prolonged military confrontation with Iran. Saudi leaders understand that once a regional war begins, controlling its consequences may become impossible. The kingdom has invested enormous political and financial resources into transforming its economy through Vision 2030. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's ambitious modernization program designed to reduce Saudi dependence on oil and turn the kingdom into a global investment and tourism hub. A full-scale war across the Gulf could threaten everything Saudi Arabia has been trying to build: oil infrastructure, airports, shipping lanes, financial markets, and massive development projects could all become tar. Yet, during a regional conflict, even limited military escalation could create economic shockwaves capable of destabilizing global energy markets within days. That reality explains why Riyadh's strategy increasingly appears built around one central objective: deterrence without total escalation. Saudi Arabia wants to demonstrate strength and protect its regional influence. But at the same time, the kingdom also wants to avoid becoming the center of a catastrophic regional war. The balancing act became even more difficult after Iran launched missile and drone attacks targeting Gulf infrastructure during the recent escalation. Several regional governments strongly condemned the attacks and warned Tehran against further aggression. Saudi Arabia reportedly strengthened military readiness, expanded regional coordination efforts, and increased defensive measures across strategic locations. At the same time, however, Riyadh also continued diplomatic communication efforts aimed at reducing escalation. That reflects a major shift in Saudi foreign policy compared to previous years. Not long ago, Saudi Arabia and Iran were locked in one of the Middle East's most intense regional rivalries. Their competition stretched across Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. Relations became so hostile that diplomatic ties were completely severed. But in recent years, Saudi Arabia began recalculating its regional strategy. Saudi leaders increasingly recognized that endless confrontation was draining resources and creating instability that threatened long-term economic goals. Gradually, Riyadh moved toward diplomacy and eventually restored formal relations with Tehran after years of hostility. That does not mean trust suddenly exists between both powers. The distrust remains deep. Saudi Arabia still sees Iran's regional activities as a major challenge to Gulf security. Iran, meanwhile, continues accusing Gulf countries of cooperating with Western and Israeli efforts designed to weaken Tehran. But despite those tensions, Riyadh now appears more focused on managing confrontation rather than accelerating it. That difference became highly visible during the latest crisis. While some regional players reportedly favored stronger and more aggressive action against Iran, Saudi Arabia appeared determined to avoid becoming the launchpad for a wider regional war. According to regional reports, Riyadh made it clear that Saudi territory should not be used to ignite direct military confrontation with Tehran. Saudi leaders reportedly feared that once war spreads across the Gulf, no country in the region would remain protected from its consequences. Those fears are not theoretical. The Gulf region contains some of the world's most important energy infrastructure. Oil production facilities, export terminals, pipelines, and shipping routes remain highly vulnerable during periods of military escalation. The Strait of Hormuz alone handles a massive percentage of global oil shipments. Any disruption on there could send energy prices skyrocketing and trigger immediate instability across international markets. Iran has repeatedly demonstrated its ability to threaten shipping lanes and strategic infrastructure throughout the Gulf. Saudi officials understand that reality better than almost anyone. That is why Riyadh's strategy increasingly combines military preparedness with diplomatic restraint. Saudi Arabia has strengthened air defenses, expanded regional military coordination, and increased security readiness across critical infrastructure sites. Behind the scenes, the kingdom has also reportedly pursued indirect communication efforts designed to reduce the risk of uncontrollable escalation. The UAE, meanwhile, appears to be operating from a different strategic calculation. Abu Dhabi has pursued a far more assertive regional policy over the past decade. The Emirates expanded military operations abroad, deepened intelligence partnerships, and openly strengthened relations with Israel after normalization agreements transformed regional dynamics. As a result, some analysts now believe that Gulf unity is weaker than it appears publicly. Behind official meetings and diplomatic statements, Gulf powers are increasingly pursuing separate agendas shaped by their own national interests and long-term ambitions. That fragmentation may become one of the defining geopolitical developments of the coming years. At the same time, Iran continues expanding its military posture across the region. Tehran invested heavily in missiles, drones, naval capabilities, and regional proxy networks. Iranian officials repeatedly warned that any attack targeting Iranian territory will trigger widespread retaliation throughout the Gulf. Those warnings are being taken extremely seriously inside Saudi Arabia. The kingdom still remembers previous attacks targeting major Saudi oil facilities. Those strikes exposed how vulnerable even heavily defended infrastructure can become during regional conflict. Since then, Saudi Arabia has accelerated military modernization efforts and invested heavily in defensive systems. But Saudi leaders also understand that no defense shield can guarantee complete protection during a large-scale war. That fear partly explains why Riyadh increasingly emphasizes diplomacy alongside military readiness. Even during the height of the latest tensions, Saudi Arabia reportedly continued indirect diplomatic efforts aimed at preventing escalation from spiraling out of control. The kingdom understands that regional stability is now directly connected to its economic future. Vision 2030 is not simply an economic reform program. It is the foundation of Saudi Arabia's long-term transformation strategy. Massive investments in technology, tourism, entertainment, infrastructure, artificial intelligence, and international business partnerships all depend heavily on regional stability. Foreign investors do not pour billions of dollars into regions consumed by missile attacks and regional wars. Saudi leaders know that very clearly. That reality is shaping the kingdom's modern geopolitical calculations. At the same time, Saudi Arabia also cannot afford to appear weak. The kingdom still wants to maintain its position as the dominant Arab power in the Gulf. Riyadh cannot allow Iran to threaten regional security without response, because doing so could damage Saudi credibility and influence across the Middle East. That creates an extremely difficult balancing act for Mohammed bin Salman. Respond too aggressively, and the region risks sliding toward catastrophic war. Respond too cautiously, and Saudi Arabia risks appearing vulnerable. So Riyadh is trying to walk a narrow line between deterrence and restraint. Military readiness across the Gulf has increased significantly. Regional governments are coordinating defensive systems more closely than before. Naval patrols near strategic waterways intensified, and intelligence cooperation expanded dramatically during recent tensions. But behind closed doors, diplomatic efforts are also accelerating. Regional powers understand that once direct war erupts between Iran and a coalition involving Israel and Gulf states, the conflict could rapidly spread across multiple countries, including Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and the Gulf itself. Oil infrastructure could face sustained attacks. Global markets could panic, international shipping routes could become severely disrupted, and millions of civilians across the region would ultimately suffer the consequences. That is the nightmare scenario Saudi Arabia appears desperate to avoid. Mohammed bin Salman now finds himself navigating one of the most complicated geopolitical environments in the modern history of the Middle East. The kingdom wants strong security partnerships with the United States. It wants military cooperation with Western allies. It wants regional influence and strategic leverage, but Saudi Arabia also increasingly wants independence in decision-making. Riyadh no longer appears willing to blindly follow every regional confrontation pushed by its allies. Saudi leaders are increasingly acting according to their own long-term strategic calculations, and those calculations currently favor preventing total regional collapse. That does not mean peace is guaranteed. The Middle East remains extremely volatile. Miscalculations, military incidents, or sudden escalation could still trigger a much wider regional conflict at any moment. Iran continues expanding military capabilities. Israel remains deeply focused on countering Tehran. The UAE appears increasingly assertive, and Saudi Arabia is trying to balance deterrence, diplomacy, and economic survival all at once. The result is a region entering a new and uncertain phase where old assumptions are collapsing and traditional alliances are being tested like never before. For now, Saudi Arabia seems determined to avoid becoming fully trapped inside a direct anti-Iran military sea. Riyadh wants stability, economic growth, controlled regional influence, and protection of its long-term ambitions, not an endless war capable of destroying the Gulf's future. Whether that strategy succeeds may determine the future direction of the entire Middle East. Because if tensions continue rising unchecked, the next confrontation may not remain limited. And if the Gulf region is pulled into a full-scale conflict involving Iran, Israel, and multiple Arab states, the consequences could reshape regional stability, global politics, and international energy markets for years to come.